For the second of my painting guides for the Prussian Army of 1813, we're looking at the Reserve Infantry, using the plastic box set by Wargames Atlantic, sculpted wearing the regulation grey uniform. Like my video on the line infantry, I'll be using paints from the Citadel range, following the classic approach of base, shade and highlight, to a high-ish tabletop standard. For base coats you will need Dawnstone, Rakarth Flesh, Dryad Bark, Rhinox Hide, Leadbelcher, Balthazar Gold, Cadian Fleshtone, Abaddon Black, various hair colours such as Gawthor Brown and Zandri Dust, and your appropriate facing colour for the collar patches. On which I need to make a short disclaimer. Already by mid-1813, only 5 of the reserve regiments, plus 1 line regiment, wore the same regulation uniform that's featured on these sculpts. Even amongst those regiments, there's still a ton of variation in the details, for which I've produced a handy table, so that I'm not stopping to list half a dozen exceptions every few minutes in the painting guide. The figure I'm working on today is from the 1st Battalion of the 7th Reserve Infantry Regiment, so if I mention something being per the table later on, this is what I'm referring back to. For all the whys and wherefores behind the complexity of some plain grey uniforms, plus whatever the other regiments were wearing, I've made a separate in-depth uniformology video on the topic, linked in the corner of the screen. Now, that's quite enough tables. We begin from a grey primer, over which we'll just give a quick security coat of Dawnstone, in the case of those regiments wearing grey, just in case the primer missed anywhere. This is going on the trousers, jacket, the cap or Schirmütze, and for most regiments the greatcoat roll as well, worn either across the torso or, on some figures in the box, strapped to the top of the knapsack. Per the table, however, my unit carried ones that were off-white, so instead I use Rakarth Flesh, which you'll also want for the small regulation knapsack, sculpted on half the figures in the set. You'll also use this for the straps by which it's worn, the linen haversack, and for some regiments the crossbelt for the cartridge pouch, but these guys had theirs in black, so I'll leave that for now. Moving on. For the figures wearing the other style of knapsack, paint the calfskin body in Rhinox Hide. Then, with Dryad Bark, paint the wood on the stock and body of the musket. Take note here that half the sculpts seem to have their muskets rotated inwards towards the body, so the barrel is pushed up against their torso, while it's the wood that's facing directly forwards. Speaking of which, I use Leadbelcher for all the metalwork on the miniature, including the lock, barrel, and bayonet of the musket, plus the buttons on the jacket, shoulder strap, and gaiters. You can, if you like, paint the butt plate of the musket in Balthazar Gold. This works better, I find, than most of the brass colours that Citadel produces. Skins next, using Cadian Fleshtone. Simple enough. Collar patches and shoulder straps, if present, are next. Mephiston Red for both in the case of this regiment. I use Abaddon Black for the gaiters and boots, cartridge pouch, the little strap around the end of the greatcoat roll, the peak of the Schirmütze, the undershirt that's visible just between the flaps of the collar, and the aforementioned crossbelt for the cartridge pouch, which is much easier to see on figures whose greatcoats aren't in the way. If you've used any heads with a shako instead of a Schirmütze, then you'll want to paint their oilskin covers in black as well. And for the last of the base coats, I've picked Gawthor Brown for this one's hair. After performing any touch-ups required, it's time for a good wash with Agrax Earthshade. Once that's all dry, it's time for the highlights. And just so that you don't think I'm trying to gaslight you, yes, the figure I'm painting now has a different head. It's his non-facially identical twin or something, after an incident with the footage. Anyway, highlights. The colours needed for this stage are Dawnstone, Administratum Grey, Eschin Grey, Rakarth Flesh, again, Ulthuan Grey, Gawthor Brown, Kislev Flesh, Runefang Steel, an appropriate highlight for your hair colour, in my case, Baneblade Brown, and one for the facing colour. We start with Dawnstone, going back over all the mid-tones, just reinforcing the grey colour, while leaving anywhere in the recesses that the Agrax has tinted. Then, using Administratum Grey, cautiously and sparingly add a few thin highlights to any sharp creases in the fabric or around its edges. Some painters do prefer to be a lot bolder with their highlights, taking the view that you're going to be looking at figures from a couple of feet away in most cases anyway, so impact is what counts. That might look something like this. It can seem a bit stripy from up close, and I just find it a bit excessive personally, so I prefer to keep mine understated. I was reminded in the comments to a previous guide I uploaded of a good trick for battalions, being to skip a few steps, thus saving some of your precious time, on miniatures destined for the second row of the unit. The figure already looks perfectly serviceable as it is, if I'm honest, so feel free to bow out at whatever stage you choose, but for those of us with borderline neurosis about such things, let's press on, shall we? In Eshin Grey, add highlights to anything in black. So that's the gaiters, boots, cartridge pouch, great roll strap, cap brim, undershirt, and, if applicable, the cross belt for the cartridge pouch. Back to Rakarth's flesh now. I use this to reinforce the mid-tone on the great coat roll for this regiment, the linen haversack, and its strap across the body. And don't forget to do the same for any figures which have the greatcoat strapped at the top of their knapsack as well. Adding a little Ulthuan grey into the Rakarth flesh to lighten it up slightly, I paint over the mid-tones on the small regulation knapsack, again just leaving agrax where it's pulled in the recesses. And then, in pure Ulthuan grey, I paint any straps and belts that would be white. On ones with the larger packs, you also have the ties around the greatcoat to do as well, plus those holding the lid of the knapsack shut. Next, with Gorthal Brown, highlight the wood of the musket. I also use this, applied in little dashes, to give some texture to the calf skin of the larger knapsacks on some figures. The end's in sight now. Use Kislev flesh for the skin highlights, Runefang steel for the metalwork, the appropriate highlight for your facing colour, and last but not least, apply a quick highlight to his hair. And there we go, one completed reservist. So, what do I think of the set? Well, the research into the uniforms is pretty good. Being monopose figures, you can achieve a pretty characteristic sense of variety across a unit, between those with and without gaiters, the different style of knapsack, and different positions of the greatcoat, plus the heads are interchangeable as well, to create units equipped wholly with caps, shakos, or a mix of the two. The detail is there as well in the sculpting for the most part. The surfaces are pretty smooth compared to the more pronounced features you'll see on some sets, but then they have been 3D sculpted, so that's what you get. And the muskets are a bit rudimentary. The bands connecting the barrel to the body aren't there, for instance, neither is the musket strap, conventionally seen on the underside of the weapon, or any elbow on the bayonet fitting. It looks like it's kind of just an extension of the barrel itself, which is a little odd, but I'm nitpicking here. The posing of the figures is where I suspect there'll be a few more critics. There's something uncanny about quite a few of them. They have this kind of lumbering, heavy-footed gait, some with an arm swinging out very wide of the torso. They're better than the Warlord Games plastic Landwehr sculpts for sure, but there's still that slight Night of the Living Dead vibe to a couple of them. Tightly packed on a base, however, it's not that noticeable, and I'm quite happy with the effect. I was considering combining some of these figures on bases themselves with some of the peri-metal reservists, like I suspect I'll end up doing with metal and plastic Landwehr sculpts when I get there. Here's how it looks as an experiment with the reservists. When you do come to work on a battalion of your own, it's worth noting that although you receive 60 figures in a box, so it's pretty good value, there are no command figures included. I'd recommend the Peri-Plastic command sprue over their specific metal reservist command set, since, as you can see from this comparison, the proportions and sculpting style of the plastics on the left match better than that of their metal reservist figures on the right. The command are available as an individual sprue from their website for the very reasonable price of £3, linked in the description. It's worth noting here that there's no issue with uniform differences whatsoever between the plastic and metals in this case, since the officer, musician and NCO wore the uniform of the reservists' Stamm or parent regiment in any case, meaning it's identical to that of a line infantry regiment, for which the sprue was created. This further means that the facing colours for the officers will also be identical to that of their parent regiment. To work out which unit goes with which, I've produced another handy table. When it comes to painting them, simply watch my video on Prussian line infantry. So that's it for the regulation reservist uniform at least. One day I do hope to paint up some of the other reserve uniforms, just for the sake of completion I guess, but given that they won't feature in the same corps as the brigade that I'm working on at the moment, it might be a little while until I get to those. Anyway, thank you so much for staying till the end of this guide. There's a few other videos I have in the pipeline at the moment, but for the Prussians, the next uniform and painting guides will be on those landwehr, as I crack on with the infantry for my collection. So I hope to see you there. Best of luck with all your hobbying, and until next time.